we're very excited to have another episode of Fathers Arise. We're doing the Forefathers series, and really, this is a time for us to equip and encourage men to father with the Father's heart. That's really the spirit of these kinds of conversations, and the way in which we're kicking it off is with our Forefathers series. And so I've been blessed in my life to have a number of men who've come into it that have really been walking the journey ahead of me and have taught me so much about myself and priorities and how to really walk well through this life. And so here we have Dane Anthony. Dane, welcome so much. Thank you for being with us. Dane and I met back in 2015, I think it was, as my wife and I were zooming across the country, ended up being 3 different times on a road trip, and it was one of probably the milestone moments of my life that I could understand as an adult, sitting down and talking with you to really get some real clarity around who I was as a person and understand how to really navigate my inner world. So that's really going to be the context of our conversation here, is how do you actually hear what's happening in your heart as a man? And Dane, I'd love for you to kind of give everyone a bit of understanding about who you are and what you've been involved in to kind of set the stage.
Sure. Thank you, Chad. It's really great to be here. I have been vocationally in professional ministry through higher education for 30 plus years. I was a university chaplain and administrator, and then taught in the School of Religion for a number of years at a local liberal arts school. I think in the context of that, I began to connect with the absence of the presence of men, or the presence of the absence, or the absence of the presence of men, as you described, who were out in front, leading the way, I think in particularly in a really vulnerable, courageous way, and using language that felt kind of risky. That was, as I said to you earlier before we came online, that really was invitational. That was inviting me into a much deeper conversation about the internal parts of my life. John O'Donohue, the Irish poet, talks about it as the inner landscape. And exploring and wandering that territory in ways that helped me connect with my spirit and my soul, not just with the occupation that I had, or not just in the way that I was kind of doing life on a daily basis. And somewhere along the line, there was a shift in that, and I began to see that my father and the men that I was around had not done that themselves. And so we're not really able to do that for others. And it was in response to one of your questions, kind of replayed a scene in which I saw that I was now turning into new territory, uncharted territory, really. Yeah. That was a masculine journey. It was a deeply spiritual journey, and I've looked back with gratitude that was a turn that I took, having no idea what it would ask of me or require of me.
Around what age were you when you took that turn, would you say?
I was probably in my mid-30s. And it was, I had a very specific moment. I think I was on a retreat and realized that I had passed my father emotionally, developmentally, and I was asking questions that I recognized in trying to engage him in dialogue around that he had not considered, and was not either able to, willing. I just wasn't interested, maybe, I don't know, in going there with me. And that's when it felt like, wow, I think I'm on my own. And I remember feeling really sad about that, and a real palpable loneliness, but I also didn't feel alone in it. I knew that God was in that conversation with me in ways that I would learn over time, and I'm still learning how God is present in that conversation. and began to look for men, just in the way that you're even doing this series, men who could model that for me, show me the way, shine a spotlight on the path, all kinds of metaphorical references to that. And most of them early on came in the form of authors. And there were men that I was being directed to by a couple of men that I began to trust, to encourage me to go into that territory. And so I really see those authors as kind of spiritual path, mentors for me. And most of them I'm still reading, and some of them are alive, some of them I've met, and just continue to pursue that path.
Yeah. And so that's taken you into sort of now how does that sort of bring us to what you are engaged in currently?
I moved out of higher ed about 3 years ago. I had been doing some spiritual direction work, went through some training to do that. And I also went through some training with Parker Palmer, who is one of those mentors for me, in a retreat process it's called courage work, literally, a circle of trust courage work. And our kind of mantra of sorts is helping us reconnect our role and our soul. And the word that I use often around that is the integration of those. Parker uses language like living an undivided life, which I really, really like. That feels, again, very invitational. And so I stepped away to form my own business called SOULPRINT. And my desire is to create clarity and openness and possibility for individuals, and so some businesses too, but individuals mostly. So I meet with people individually in the building that I'm sitting in today, called the Shelter, and we enter into a ongoing and deeper conversation about what the Spirit is stirring within us. And I see my role as a deep listener. I know that we have people who listen at us and to us all day long, but we rarely have people who listen with us or for us, kind of alongside us. And that really is how I understand the really sacred work of spiritual direction, is listening, not with an agenda to get somewhere, but to be present to where we are right now. And I think that's something that is pretty countercultural for men in particular, which is 90% of the people that I meet with are men, kind of your age group, a little older, and they're all looking for a way to connect. I was just with a younger man this morning who's really struggling with the difference between occupation and vocation, and the space in his life to explore that, and the desire to and the fear to, and which I'll probably talk more about fear as we go on. But I see all these things in our lives as teachers, and I have this phrase that I came to a number of years ago that I call prayerful curiosity. And it's about as close as I can get to understanding what I sense Paul meant by praying without ceasing or praying continually. Is the choice to keep choosing to pay attention to what may be going on around us and in us, and how that is part of the ongoing dialogue with our Creator. The ways in which God desires to be in conversation with us. In the words of St. Francis, preach the gospel everywhere, and if you have to, use words. And so that prayerful conversation for me is often born more out of silence, and presence, than it is about a lot of words.
So I'm curious, just to you had mentioned something about sort of leaning into this inner journey, but I'm curious just to sort of like take a big step back and ask the question, the really simple question of, why is it important for men to lean into understanding this inner world? I think that some men sort of might come upon the realization of the importance earlier. Some might not at all. So what's at stake? Why should we even lean into this space that is within?
That's a great question, Chad. Well, I do believe that our lives are constantly speaking to us. The Quakers use the phrase for the Holy Spirit as the voice of the inner teacher. And I think that for me, it's really a powerful way to connect to this internal conversation that all of us are always having. My wife tells me I speak in double negatives a lot. This is a conversation we're never not having.
Right.
Or a conversation that's going on in us. And we're either engaged in it or we're not. And I think we're made to engage in it. We're made to do what you and I are doing today, of exploring both certainty and the possibility that this conversation, that God has both authored and nurturing this conversation in us to know ourselves. I think about it this way: when God dreamed up the idea of Chad and of Dane, God took a sliver of God's self and said, "Go be Chad and go be Dane. Please go be Chad and Dane. Yeah. Don't be a giraffe. Don't be a turtle. Don't be that guy over there. Be who I dreamed you to be." And that God's desire for us, or God's will for us, is that we explore what that looks like today, so that we know more about that today and can experience it and speak out of it than we did the day before. And in doing that, we bring that unique image of God that we each carry into the world. And the world gets to experience facets of God that it won't or doesn't if we don't show up in that. And I think being engaged in that conversation and knowing what that is the curiosity. I use the phrase paying attention, which I'll probably go back to a lot. I think it is what we're called and asked to do, is to pay attention.
It's interesting because it feels like there's, as you mentioned, the word, the invitation. So like God sort of weaves the invitation into us to understand more of who we are, from the very beginning. So there's that ongoing opportunity to sort of mine the depths, because it's there for you to explore, but you have to make that choice. But it almost kind of feels like it's met with the tension of the world that we encounter. And so I think that, especially for the millennial generation, so much of our formative years was orbiting this concept of purpose and this concept of engaging in the world around you and doing something, affecting some sort of change. And so some of the pitfalls that I've seen with people of my generation is that so much of their identity has been woven into the concept of purpose, i.e., what do I do? What is the thing that I am doing that is meant to be the call on my life? And so I don't necessarily agree with that in terms of orienting your existence around your purpose or what you do. But it's almost, I'm curious if you kind of help us sort of like weave the two of these things together.
Sure.
Because they get very entangled.
That's a conversation that I'm having almost all the time, it seems. And I think some of the language that I use, I'm very specific about words. I actually have a list of words I don't use anymore because they don't describe the reality or the truth of how I experience this in my life. Maybe we may talk about that some in a little bit. But I think if we think about the jobs that we have lots of language for the things that describe this thing we go to and do, or the thing we get money for. It's job, profession, occupation, work. But at the core of it, I believe, is the word vocation, where we get the idea of calling from. It comes from the Latin root word for to call or to hear, to listen or to hear. And that to me is much more about who we are at our core, about our being, than it is about our doing. And so think that the two words that struck a real contrast for me in that, maybe even a bit of a conflict, is vocation and occupation.
Mm-hmm.
That there are things that occupy us, our mind, our thoughts, our attention, our ideas, and this deeper conversation you and I are speaking about that has not a lot to do with the job that we have.
Right.
Sometimes there may be some overlap in the work that I do. I experience a lot of overlap in that.
Yeah, and we do. I do as well in terms of like being able to engage in both at the same time.
Right. So I think there are, when you asked the question earlier about understanding and navigating this inner world and how it shows up in this place, is that one of our teachers are the feelings that we have about the life that we're in. And I think that's where you and I actually began our conversation way back. Yeah. And that as men, we, certainly my generation, I'm early 60s, we were not encouraged to live out of our feelings unless it was happy. I even remember my grandmother saying to my brothers and I just want you boys to be happy. I just want you to be happy. Mm-hmm. Somewhere along the line, I took that message to also mean any other feeling wasn't okay.
Right. Yeah.
And I think they're coming back into a sense that our feelings are not just good or bad. Our feelings are pretty neutral in themselves. Mm-hmm. It's what we do as we engage with them that becomes really the life we live into. Mm-hmm. And those things that are going on in us, this is maybe where I start talking about fear and shame, the ways in which we're influenced by those to either deny them, ignore them, get over them. And we have lots of cultural sayings for little boys. Big boys don't cry. Figure it out yourself. Nobody's going to do this but you. You know, lots of self-sufficiency kinds of things that drive us into isolation, where we think I think this is one of the lies of toxic shame for me, that I should be able to know how to do something that I've never done before. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of crazy, Chad. Yeah. But we live as though that's true. Mm-hmm. And it sends us into isolation. And I think this, one of the biggest lies of shame that I encounter with men is nobody else knows what I'm feeling but me. Mm-hmm. Nobody could possibly understand this. Mm. And yet the experience is so incredibly common. Mm-hmm. And I often refer to it as the fear-shame spiral. And in my experience, it only goes one direction. And the sense of that is, and when I mean fear and shame, I mean kind of in their kind of toxic form. Mm. The toxic aspect of shame that leads me to believe that I'm either better than you or I'm worse than you. And it puts us on a ladder immediately.
Things would be dominance or some sort of subservience.
Some of the language I would use for that is that it would lead me to pride and arrogance on one side, or self-diminishment on the other. Mm-hmm. And I know those places well. I also know that there's a center place between those that fits this. Another St. Francis quote, I am who I am in the eyes of God, nothing more, nothing less, is for me kind of the mantra of my healthy fear and shame. I want to know more about that what I am, who I am in the eyes of God, which fits that kind of sliver thing again for me, coming full circle. Yeah. But I also sense that fear and shame are really good teachers. They're very primal and powerful feelings. You know, we use them to parent our children when we're not really paying attention. But they can lead us to isolation if we're not being careful. Yeah. And there's a gift in fear that I call it the feeling that helps us pay attention. You know, we pull out of a driveway and we look both ways because that's fear helping us say, like, slow down, pay attention, take care.
Yeah. It kind of feels like it's not so much that men don't experience these things. I think it feels like maybe it's more about they just don't know what to do with them. hasn't been a training or an
Right.
equipment or a leading and a guiding on what to do with some of the things that you know, how do you take them and do something healthy with them versus maybe what culture might reinforce, which is might tend to push you into a negative space.
Mhm. Well, I think part of it is, I use this language a lot, is we cannot unknow our experience, but
Hmm.
we can unlearn the ways that we've been in relationship with it in order for God to help us learn a new way.
Hmm.
I think you asked a question somewhere about overcoming things. And I don't know in my experience that I've overcome them, but I've found a way in time and thoughtful work and prayer and meditation to become, to find myself in a new relationship with it. So I have a different relationship with this shame voice
Hmm.
that's been this really powerful influencer in my life, so that it has less influence. But
Hmm.
it hasn't gone away. It still shows up, and but I can see it differently. I can experience it differently. I can make choices about how I engage or don't engage with it.
Hmm.
How I listen to that old voice or move to a new way to be in relationship with it.
Hmm.
Uh, I think that does take some really thoughtful work, including therapy. And um, I lead a number of men's therapeutic groups with some therapist colleagues, and we're having this conversation.
Hmm.
Okay, we're never not having this conversation because it's such a present dynamic. I think for men, fear and shame are probably our two primary feelings that we're navigating around. And because they're so primal, we all feel them.
Hmm.
And learning and encountering, maybe even confronting the messages that they offer us, that we are less than who we are, or we're better than someone else, um, is a way to learn both the gift of them of humility and wisdom. um, Really see that shame can lead us to humility, because it really helps moderate. It is the moderating feeling, keeps us from doing things. We wear clothes because we have shame,
Hmm.
and it's not bad. It just helps us moderate. Like this is a good thing to do, and we stop at stop signs, because even if no one's around, because that's a healthy shame, saying you're not more important than everyone else.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're also not less than everyone else.
Hmm.
And the gift of that has been and continues to be a really significant teacher for me.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, and to your point about words, you know, words holding so much power, being really clear about what those words mean to you. I mean, for example, I mean, some people might, I mean, the word shame might be a tough one for people to perceive and understand as a good thing, versus, you know, maybe there's some other word that more fully to them explains the healthy side of that, whether it's meekness or humility or whatever that might be. But it's the understanding of, um, I guess it's maybe its importance, where it's not I'm not important enough, or I like I'm not enough, because shame would say you're not enough,
Right.
versus something like humility, where humility says, there is something like higher than you,
Mhm.
where it's the dynamic, the orientation is the same, but the sense of identity is different. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm aware that I use a very particular language around that. Um, there's a book called Voice of the Heart by Chip Dodd that's been really influential there, and talks about both the gifts and the impairments of our feelings, and introduces, a particular set of language around some core feelings
Mhm.
that have been really, really influential, transformative for me and my marriage,
Mhm.
and with the people, particularly men that I work with, to reframe a language, give us a common language that I
Yeah.
think is really important. And whether we use these 8 feelings words that I use, or we use language that you would use, um, either way, we need to be having the conversation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
With ourselves, with God, with the people in our life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, where would you suggest this inner journey begin? What is a first step that, because I think that we've, at least in my understanding, I think that we've unpacked a good understanding of why it's imperative to journey within and get clarity around who God made you to be, how to fully step into all that He has designed into you, how to sort of hear your calling in the world and start to walk out and activate that, not tied to a job, but sort of tied to your identity.
Right.
So there's quite an urgency around men, people in general, men specifically, to really investigate this space. So what's a good first step to really to move into it?